supposed to be, you'll see I think it's recording now. I can see it.
Yep, great. Go ahead.
Awesome. Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is our first public webinar. So thanks, Dominique, for suggesting that we make this a public one. I think it was a great decision, and it's also interesting to experiment with that format and see what we can do with it in the future. So thanks for that. And so for those of you who may not know HRNA, HRNA stands for the Harm Reduction Nurses Association. It's a collective of primarily nurses in harm reduction, but also non-nurses and nursing students. That was created in 2017 as just to fill a gap, I would say, in terms of connecting with each other across the country, also sharing information in a rapidly developing field, ensuring that we try to have this national voice so that we are able to sit at tables nationally and express a position that is the position of harm reduction nurses, and also tackle some issues that have to do with nursing practice specifically. So the organization was not created to necessarily exclude anybody, but there we saw a lot of issues specific to nursing practice that were emerging, and we didn't necessarily have a group to address that. And so we've been doing a lot of things. This is a volunteer run organization. None of us are getting paid to do this. But we have an elected board of directors. I'm the president. I'm serving a 3-year mandate. My name is Mathieu Gagnon. I'm a nursing professor at UVic, and I've been involved in all sorts of harm reduction related stuff and HIV over the years. And so, yeah, we've been super busy. And one of the things that we felt was important is to try to offer as many educational opportunities as possible. And we've been offering monthly webinars for a while now and recording them and making like slides and articles available, in addition to other things like a mentorship program, a community of practice fund on urban harm reduction, developing position statements, developing a international consensus statement on the role of nurses in supervised consumption sites, sitting on a bunch of groups, and just like things are just very busy. I'm sure you can guess based on how fast this field is evolving. And so this webinar, which is our Valentine's Day special, it's is really looking at the evolution of harm reduction based on a great paper that Nick was the lead author on, and she's generously offered her time and expertise to do this talk for us today. Everything that we do is because our members and partners and allies are generous and give their time. Like I said before, all of this is just a collective project that's just based on our deep passion for harm reduction and willingness to, share with each other and mentor each other and teach each other. So that's kind of setting the stage for today. And I'm really excited to see such a great turnout. We have 31 people right now on the webinar, which is a record, I think. It's pretty fantastic. I'm really excited. And I know that Dominique, you're a great speaker, and I was looking forward to hearing you talk all week. So I'll hand it over to you. Normally the format is we try to keep it within 45 minutes. I know I took a little bit of time, but 5 minutes, but then we open it up for questions and discussions. And of course, we can always go a little bit over, but we always make sure we offer it in a way that fits an hour for everyone's busy schedule. So on that note, I'll stay here. I'll always be here if there's something, but I won't let my, I'll kind of stop my camera just so that you're not just everyone staring at my face and mute my phone. But if there's anything, you let me know, Dominique, and otherwise I'll just let you take the lead.
Sounds great. Thank you, Mary Lou. Okay, so my name is Dominique Denis Lalonde. I am an RN in Calgary. That's in Alberta, just in case anybody's from elsewhere. I'm a proud member of the Harm Reduction Nurses Association since its inception. And I have been looking forward to sharing this content with you for quite some time. So I'm really glad you've all tuned in. This webinar is going to present the results of the work that myself and some of my colleagues at the University of Calgary have recently published. I'm just gonna. So I wanted to start out with this quote. Harm reduction is that most unfortunate of beings, a term in search of a meaning. And I felt like this was a really good quote to start with, even though it had been written, 25 years ago. I feel like it still sums up a lot of what I'm seeing and why I decided to do an analysis of this concept of harm reduction. So I have worked in a variety of harm reduction environments, and I saw just a whole lot of different opinions and interpretations and applications of harm reduction. So an example is the idea of harm reduction housing. You know, for some people, harm reduction housing meant that individuals are expected to abstain from drugs and alcohol, but they weren't going to be punished or kicked out of their housing if they are caught using. Whereas for other folks and perhaps other organizations, harm reduction housing meant that people were allowed to use drugs or alcohol in their own homes, thus allowing them to be safely housed while using. So I found some discrepancies like this that led me to want to know, you know, what has harm reduction been historically? Where are we now? What does it mean going forward? And I put a rainbow on this slide because I felt like harm reduction is a bit like the double rainbow. You know, it's like, we all love it, but like, what does it mean? And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you need to go YouTube double rainbow. And I'll just have to assume that people are laughing at my jokes. Here's our outline for today. Like Mary Lou said, I do definitely want to leave time for Q&A and discussion at the end because I'm really curious to hear your feedback and perspectives on this. What I'm hoping that you'll get out of this webinar is to learn about where harm reduction came from and why, and what some of the key characteristics are based on the published literature. I hope that it'll be a bit of a point of reference for the implementation and planning and evaluation of harm reduction in different practice settings, and that it allows us to better communicate about harm reduction so that when we're, you know, advocating to stakeholders or we're educating the next generation of nurses or what have you, that we're a little bit more clear about what we're talking about. And now I realize this webinar, it deviates a little bit from previous webinar content from the Harm Reduction Nurses Association, because it's a little bit more theoretical, philosophical, and less tangible. But I hope that it is valuable nonetheless and that it spurs some good discussion. To me, it's super interesting. I'm a little bit of a dork that way. I find it interesting to dissect what the underpinnings are of the work that we do and that we care about so much. Okay, so the work that I did is called a concept analysis, and there's various frameworks for doing this sort of work. The one I chose is a Rogers method, and it's called an evolutionary approach because you're looking at how something has changed over time. I picked this because it felt right, because I didn't want to come up, the purpose was not to come up with a definition or like the one truth about harm reduction. It was more to just clarify this dynamic and evolving phenomena, and to focus on what is possible as a result of understanding and applying this concept. So as such, I want to note that this isn't like the be-all end-all of harm reduction, and there's even some parts of my analysis that I don't necessarily agree with, but it's what's in the literature. So, you know, what's been published so far. So that being said, yeah, I hope it's still useful, but I want you to know that it's a living document. It's always going to be changing. It's just sort of a snapshot of where we are right now. So just a little bit about data collection. There's more in the paper if you're interested in that sort of thing. I did do a database search to find all of the published works that I was going to look at. And I was unable to find any published work prior to 1995 that used the term harm reduction as is. So that's why 1995 to 2018 was included. And, you know, you're probably going, what? How's that possible? But it's true. There's a lot of literature out there that focuses on the benefits of different harm reduction applications. You know, we know about the benefits of needle distribution. We know about the benefits of supervised consumption. So that wasn't necessarily what I was looking at. I was looking more about the concept and what does it mean. So there's a lot less on that. I did have some inclusion and exclusion criteria here. So I did focus on health and social aspects of harm reduction related to the use of illegal drugs. anything that was about tobacco or sex work or gambling exclusively, I excluded from my analysis. Okay, so first part of the process of analysis here was to identify surrogate terms and relevant uses. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see that there's a lot of different terms that harm reduction is conflated with. This first one, harm minimization, that was actually, it's an Australian thing. So the Australian government, they were early adopters of harm reduction, and their national drug strategy in 1985 included harm minimization, which was kind of new for that time, but they did not define this new term, so it kind of remained vague. The World Health Organization, they actually included harm reduction in 1973, and they said that it was an alternative to drug control. But again, didn't define it, not sure what it means. The kind of real emergence of harm reduction as we talk about it today was in 1990 in Liverpool at the first harm reduction conference. So if you will, actually, this is like the 30th anniversary of harm reduction. Amazing. So there's all these other terms that are being used, and some of you in your work might find that some of these words are being used. Risk reduction, risk minimization, even risk management, you know. And I have some ideas about why different terms are being used. It could be because harm reduction is controversial. It stirs up, you know, some feelings that maybe we don't want to bring into the workplace. But the literature pretty clearly is agreeing that we should all try and use the same terminology, the same language of harm reduction, so that we're not diffusing its meaning. On the right-hand side of the slide here is the huge variety of ways in which harm reduction is used. So it is a philosophy, it's a movement. You know, with clients, we talk about harm reduction strategies, harm reduction goals and measures. You know, you might want to establish a program or a framework of harm reduction in a workplace or a policy. And then harm reduction can also be applied to a wide variety of risk behaviors. So today I am focusing on illegal drug use, but sex work, gambling, all these other things can also, harm reduction can be applied to those as well. So you can see here that there's a lot of different ways in which harm reduction is being talked about, hence why I felt the need to attempt to clarify this broadly used term. So the next step in this evolutionary analysis is looking at the antecedents of the concept. So antecedents can be understood as the things that came before harm reduction, or things that have led to the development of harm reduction as it is today. So on the left-hand side, you have sort of historical things. We know that, you know, some of the first examples of harm reduction were opioid replacement therapies happening in the 20s, where physicians were prescribing opioid replacement therapies off-label for opioid dependency for their clients who were dependent on opioids. From there, we are all familiar with the HIV/AIDS crisis, which led to the establishment of needle distribution programs in Europe in the 80s. And these are kind of interesting because, you know, the HIV/AIDS movement and needle distribution programs, those were anarchist practices, right? It was drug users who, upon seeing their community struggling, they began supplying sterile injection supplies to other drug users out of their backpacks without government sanction or funding. They just did it because they knew that it had to be done. And that anarchist practice has now been institutionalized as public health policy and is now funded, right? So the needle distribution programs that we have, I mean, they're still not as widely available as we would all like, but for the most part, it is good public policy to have needle distribution programs. So that's in the past. Going forward on the other side of the slide here, these are kind of emerging concepts that are contributing to how harm reduction is being developed, if you will, today. So I guess the first one here is just that addiction and drug use, we're increasingly recognizing that these are complex, multifaceted issues. You know, they're not moral failings. it's much more complex than we had thought in the past. I think the recognition that the failure on drugs, the prohibition of drugs, the drug war, that failure is causing significant harm and is probably the primary source of harm for people who use drugs. And that's contributing as well to how harm reduction is being interpreted today. And then, of course, stigma. So there's a lot of strong awareness work happening around stigma related to drug use, and that's interwoven into harm reduction work as well. So it's interesting to note too, like, remember that the term harm reduction only emerged, 25, 30 years ago, yet there were many instances of it happening well before then. It just maybe hadn't been fully conceptualized. Okay. So using this approach, I identified 7 key attributes or characteristics, and we're going to discuss each of these in more depth. And in the last 3 years, some of you, who are harm reduction dorks like me, you'll notice that there's a few other authors and organizations that have developed their own principles of harm reduction. So Harm Reduction International, Harm Reduction Coalition, and then there's a few publications as well. And it's interesting because they all have similarities, for sure. Like, they're all quite close, but there's differences in language, specifically in language use. And so I think that that's just because what is in the literature might not be what we're using in our day-to-day practice. So as such, I do want to just say that this isn't the final blueprint for harm reduction. Yeah, it's just a summary of the literature so far. So let's get started and look at some of these attributes. So this is, the first one is quite unanimous in the literature, and that's that harm reduction focuses on the harms. It focuses on reducing the harms of drug use rather than on preventing, eliminating, or reducing that drug use. So that would follow then that any abstinence approach, an approach that is aimed to make people abstain from drugs or alcohol, cannot be considered harm reduction, because those are aiming for reduction of use rather than reduction of harm. So on an individual scale, a focus on harm could mean supporting a client to change their mode of administration of their drug of choice. So perhaps from injecting to smoking their drug, where the risks are a little bit lower. On a larger scale, a focus on harms could be evidence-based drug education for youth, rather than some of the not so evidence-based drug education that youth are getting, which is where this image here is from. It's the This Is Your Brain on Drugs campaign from a while back. I'm sure, well, you're probably old enough to know. But this was an example of something that it's not focusing on harms here. This is an abstinence approach. This is not giving you any actual information about drugs or how to use them or what they can do. It's just trying to promote complete abstinence from them. So not a harm reduction approach. The next one is the participation of people who use drugs. So harm reduction values people who use drugs. They're key stakeholders, or they should be, in all aspects of program planning and delivery. This means there's a high value on peer approaches and street-based outreach. And believe it or not, this is actually an emerging attribute. It wasn't found earlier in the literature at all. It's a more recent thing, but that might be why the participation of people who use drugs is kind of missing from some harm reduction initiatives still today. So an example of this is VANDU, the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, established in 1998. And these were drug users who came together to represent and advocate for their concerns. I think that an important consideration here is the historically tenuous relationship between people who use drugs and institutions. One of the authors I reviewed urged that drug users need to be at the very center of harm reduction, and they should be the driving force rather than governments or well-meaning nonprofits. And I think that idea is really important to keep in mind. And then the statement, "Nothing about us without us," I'm sure you've all heard it, originates in the HIV movement, but definitely has been co-opted as well by the harm reduction movement. The next one is harm reduction promotes human rights. Harm reduction supports the right to health, self-determination, self-preservation, and to be treated with dignity and respect. And although these things weren't always discussed as being human rights related, the ideas of dignity, respect, compassion are mentioned a lot in the literature. So although it's kind of inconsistently addressed, I felt like it was still definitely a key attribute. So the idea of being treated, that drug users should be treated like a human being with rights rather than as a criminal, even though in some contexts the use of drugs is considered criminal still. So these humanistic values of dignity and respect are aligned with human rights. And so harm reduction promotes the rights of humans. The next one will not surprise any of you, I'm sure, and is very consistent in the literature, is that harm reduction is a public health approach, right? It's closely tied to public health principles and population health promotion. And this is primarily because of its roots in the HIV movement. The literature also suggests that harm reduction should be considered part of a comprehensive continuum of care for people who use drugs. So that includes prevention, education, treatment, and follow-up. So it's not a standalone solution to drug-related harms. As we know, in Canada anyway, the public health angle of harm reduction has been pretty consistently used to garner support for harm reduction initiatives. I feel like I hear about that a lot. It's sort of the primary approach that people push when they're trying to promote harm reduction. Okay, the next one is a little bit more contentious. It's debated in the literature. It was a challenge to try and bring it together in words. So harm reduction can be considered value neutral and it's about value neutrality and non-judgment. And that's related to, drug policy, how we feel about drug behaviors, what are our values related to drug policy and people who use drugs. So this is the most contentious of the attributes identified, and it's one that I think is changing the most rapidly as well. Some harm reduction advocates will avoid all the moral questions about, drug use and what the role of the government should be in preventing or interfering with drug use. And so historically, harm reduction has maintained a mostly neutral stance towards drug policy and the criminalization of drug use and the people who use them. And this may have been in part to avoid political tension at the time,
Did Cynthia call Tahira?
If someone doesn't have their mics muted, that would be delightful if you could mute them. So several authors had discussed that this is actually a strength and a limitation of harm reduction.
What? Yeah.
Hey, can everyone just check that their mics are muted? Just take like a quick second to check.
Yeah, and if not, Dominic, you can also mute everybody if ever it gets to that point. Yeah, I mean, then after that, they have to unmute themselves to speak. But sometimes I do that just because I don't have a lot of patience for repeating these when there's like a talk. So I usually will just mute everybody if it gets to that point. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I'll just keep going and then we'll figure it out if it gets to be an issue. Okay, so where I was just saying that this is both a strength and a limitation of harm reduction, because those broader systemic goals of like what are we trying to do in terms of drug policy, how do we feel about these things, those broad systemic goals haven't been defined. But now, as we're seeing, we have calls for decriminalization, we have calls for safe drug supply. So it's clear that harm reduction values are being defined now, and supporters of harm reduction are no longer neutral on these topics, and they're actually engaging with the political tension as a result. So even saying that though, value neutrality, however, still does continue to be widely presented as a fundamental part of harm reduction, along with non-judgment and non-judgment of people who use drugs and their behaviors. And this is evidenced by the common phrase, meeting them where they're at, which initially meant leaving your own values and morals about drug use aside so that you could provide non-judgmental care. But I think this phrase is now being used more to emphasize, compassion and client-centered care. Oops. All right, next one here is that harm reduction is practical and pragmatic, and this is very consistent in the literature. So it's practical in that it's a realistic response to an immediate need, and it's pragmatic in that it's a sensible thing without concerning itself with any particular ideology. And this actually might mean that sometimes it means doing things that are not entirely legal or that are unsanctioned. So again, going back to that anarchistic vibe in which harm reduction has its roots. So an example is the overdose prevention sites that have popped up as a practical response to the immediate need for these services. This image here is from the Moss Park OPS in Toronto in 2017. Another example is when Vandu in Vancouver, they established an unsanctioned needle distribution service in Vancouver in 2001. And that was a practical, pragmatic, and quite effective response to the HIV crisis that was occurring amongst injection drug users in the downtown east side. They knew that it would help, and despite it not being legal, and despite getting into some trouble, they did it anyway because they knew that that's what needed to be done. And here's the last one here, which is also consistent in the literature, is that harm reduction is adaptive and innovative. It's, you got to be flexible, creative, and always evolving our responses to meet the dynamic needs of people who use drugs. So that means, innovating to minimize the requirements for involvement in a service and to increase access in whatever way possible. So for example, in some of the places I've worked, we were noticing that it's a barrier to track people by name. They don't want to give their name when they're accessing harm reduction resources. So, we had to find other ways of tracking people so that we could report to funders, but so that we could break down that barrier and they would still want to access the service. Another great example of harm reduction innovation is mobile supervised consumption. These images here are from the one that was developed in Calgary, but there's many others in the country and around the world. And so in Calgary, people who use drugs are not centralized, they're not all located in a single area. And so this was an approach that could help bring the service to where it's needed most, while having the flexibility to adjust the hours and adjust the locations as needed. And I say could because unfortunately the service isn't currently operational due to the change in priorities as a result of our not so new government in Alberta here. So the whole program is under review, and will remain to be seen if funding will continue, and we should know about that really soon. So this quote at the bottom here, harm reduction is a living document, I thought was a really nice way that one of the authors talked about this concept, where harm reduction is constantly changing and accommodating community needs. And as such, it will look different. It will vary by context, location, and community. So this is a strength, obviously, but in this way, it also might be difficult for policy to keep up with some of these emerging practices because they're new. And that also makes it difficult for funders to accept the changes and the deviations from what's established harm reduction practice or harm reduction responses. So again, here we have a key attribute of harm reduction that is both a strength, but also presents some significant challenges because there's no single way to enact harm reduction. And it has, intrinsically a very dynamic approach to it or aspect to it. So those are the 7 attributes. And now that we have reviewed those, let's put them into practice. Let's look at a case study. So in this case study, all 7 attributes are present. This is not to say that all attributes of harm reduction will be present at every instance of harm reduction, but there should definitely be a few. As we consider this model case, consider the attributes that we've discussed and where they might come into play. Some of them are present more than once, and some of them are quite subtle. So let's listen.
Jeff is a 28-year-old construction worker with a recent history of injecting opioids. He has been intermittently homeless for several months since he lost his job and apartment following a hospital stay. Jeff has been accessing a busy, government-sanctioned supervised consumption service that recently opened following an unprecedented increase in opioid-related overdose deaths in his city. When he enters the building, he is greeted warmly by name by the peer worker, who then asks him how his day is going and directs him to a vacant booth. As Jeff settles in and prepares his injection using the sterile equipment provided, a nurse approaches with a wheelchair, and since he often falls asleep after injecting, kindly offers it to him so he can be moved aside for monitoring, so the booth becomes available to the next client. Jeff is feeling irritable as he is not injected in many hours and begrudgingly obliges. The nurse is not bothered by this, and noticing that he is quite shaky, offers to help Jeff prepare his equipment for self-injection. Jeff declines and mutters, "I should have done this hours ago when my buddy offered his needle." The nurse gives him a gentle smile and says, "I'm glad you came here instead," and packs him a small bag of sterile injection supplies that she offers to him just in case. Jeff injects his dose and promptly dozes off. The nurse moves him to another location, watching him closely for signs of overdose. 20 minutes later, Jeff awakens and prepares to leave. The nurse asks if she can take a quick look at his veins for infection. And as she does this, Jeff asks how long it takes to get started on opioid replacement therapy and if people are successful with it. The nurse answers his questions, and the peer worker offers to connect him to a local group of people with a history of drug use called Grateful or Dead that meet monthly to share stories, provide outreach, pick up discarded needles, and advocate for policy changes. Jeff says he will consider this, and as he is leaving, the nurse invites him to return.
I hope that helps illustrate some of these attributes. And I know that many of you have lots of great examples of harm reduction in your work as well. And I'd love to hear about how some of these attributes are present or are not present. So moving forward with the next phase of analysis was looking at the consequences. So consequences are, what has occurred as a result of the existence of harm reduction and what might be possible because of the existence of harm reduction. So on the left-hand side here, we have historical consequences. I think you're probably familiar with a lot of these, but harm reduction has reduced the impact of HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis C, reduced mortality and morbidity for drug users, increases capacity for communities and individuals, and increased uptake of treatment services for people who use drugs. On the right, these are the emerging ideas that are increasingly possible, I believe, partially as a result of the existence of harm reduction. So first, I think it's pretty clear that harm reduction is helping to reduce the stigma around drug use and people who use them. We're talking about it, we're working to ensure that people who use drugs are not dying, and that is step one of reducing stigma. Still a lot of work to do though, of course. These next two concepts, benefit enhancement and benefit maximization, are very new ideas. And they refer to the idea that all individuals who use drugs are using them for a reason and are getting some sort of benefit out of it. So thus, it's possible to imagine that there's ways of enhancing or maximizing these benefits while decreasing risk or perhaps even eliminating risk associated with use of that drug. These emerging concepts extend those principles of harm reduction towards recognizing the possibility for non-problematic substance use. These ideas allow for a view of substance use as potentially beneficial or even therapeutic when used in an informed way and while using safer practices. So not only does this contribute to destigmatizing all drug use, but particularly recreational drug use. It might also, over time, serve to normalize research into the use of illegal drugs, such as psychedelic drugs, for prescribed therapeutic purposes. So examples of these would be the use of MDMA in ecstasy to enable healing for people with post-traumatic stress disorder. Or another example is the use of psilocybin, which is a compound in magic mushrooms, to treat chronic depression. And so this might seem a little bit far out, I know, but the fact that harm reduction has gotten us to where we are now is making some of these things possible. It's allowing for that leap of consciousness, if you will. I think that was a pun. I don't know. All right, the next one. We're going to look at some related concepts. So these are things that were in the literature, but you know, they were not explicitly or exclusively related to harm reduction. So just things to think about. So first off, harm reduction doesn't appear to have a specific approach to drug policy that it's promoting. However, the use of prohibition laws and criminal law incarceration of people who use drugs, that is not harm reduction. That's very clear. But legalization, decriminalization, there's kind of no defined approach currently. I think that might change very soon. That is attached to harm reduction. The next one, approaches to reducing drug-related harm in youth. There's really not a lot of literature about the use of harm reduction practices with youth who are using drugs. And I think that's because when we're talking about youth, it's kind of a whole nother can of worms. People are really uncomfortable thinking that youth are using drugs and etc. So suffice to say that there isn't much to go on when it comes to youth and harm reduction, but it's certainly an area that needs to be explored more. This next point is only going to be meaningful for you if you already have an understanding of this primary, secondary, tertiary prevention language, in which case you're a public health nerd. Welcome to the club. So here's an image to hopefully make it clear. And I'm going to give you a little example that's not drug or harm reduction related. So if we wanted to reduce the harms of exposure to the sun's harmful rays, primary prevention would be to stay in the shade, wear hats, and if you have to go out in the sun, you know, wear long sleeves. Secondary prevention would be to wear sunscreen, you know, limit your time in the sun and make sure you get screened for any signs of skin cancer. Tertiary prevention would be to promptly treat any skin malignancies, any cancer, so that they don't metastasize and create even more harm in the body. So in the literature, going back to harm reduction, it wasn't conclusive as to whether harm reduction is primary or secondary prevention. And I've even found some sources that refer to it as exclusively tertiary prevention. And I think that this is because harm reduction can actually fit into any and all of these categories all at once, depending on the perceived risk level associated with that behavior. So for example, harm reduction education in high school classrooms, for examples, I did this in my old job, that would be primary prevention because it's going to affect many, many people whose risks at that time are generally considered to be low. An example of secondary prevention would be providing drug checking services to youth or, you know, maybe at a festival to people who are using recreational drugs. Or even honestly providing injection drug use supplies to drug users, because here the perceived risk of harm is higher. And then lastly, tertiary prevention is, you know, providing naloxone and overdose teaching to someone who's at high risk of dying of an opioid overdose. So here the risk level is the harm that could be done is very high. And so you're probably asking, like, where does supervised consumption service fit in? And I would say all of the above, because there's a lot of things that happen in the supervised consumption service. So yet again, here we have harm reduction is super hard to fit into these neat little boxes that academics like, politicians like, and healthcare providers like, right? I feel like if harm reduction had a relationship status on Facebook, it would be, it's complicated, but super interesting. Okay, how are we doing for time here? We're okay. So what is in harm reduction's future? Where is it going? There's some really interesting discussion happening around the politicalization of harm reduction, where it's being tied to a certain ideology. So I want to consider a few quotes here. First one is by the executive director of the Harm Reduction Coalition. When we talk about harm reduction, we often reduce it to a public health framework, one of reducing risks. That's harm reduction with a small HR. But harm reduction with a capital HR is the movement, one that shifts resources and power to the people who are most vulnerable to structural violence. Here's another one. This one is from the amazing Garth Mullins, who, if you haven't checked out their Crackdown podcast yet, you need to. It's incredible. Any approach to the overdose crisis that doesn't seek to smash white supremacy ain't worth shit. So in these statements, there's a clear trend towards the infusion of political ideology and of changing the status quo, and that's within harm reduction, you know? And I kind of am just throwing these questions out there, but what are the benefits of infusing harm reduction with political ideology? What kind of positives can we achieve with that? And then on the flip side, what are the drawbacks of doing that? What might be some, you know, unintended consequences that we should consider? What does it mean for the future? You know, it's just something to think about. I do want to, if I have time, give you a quick cautionary tale, if you'll humor me for a second here. And it's related to just this whole politicalization and what does it actually mean? So back in the 1960s and 70s, psychedelic assisted therapies were being researched and discussed as treatments for a whole variety of illnesses. This research was publicly funded. Governments were proud of the work of psychedelic researchers at that time. We had actually a lot of it happening in Saskatchewan. However, when Timothy Leary came along and his counterculture crew, they started espousing the benefits of psychedelic drug use outside the clinical context. And this contributed to, you know, a moral panic about drug use and what it meant, and that, you know, it's going to overturn the status quo. It became very political, and it scared the crap out of people. And I think that might have been inevitable just because of its time and, you know, the context of it. But unfortunately, it did contribute to the war on drugs, where prohibition and social pressures caused the support for psychedelic research to flounder and then eventually stop altogether. And it's only now, some 50 years later, that we're seeing a reemergence of this really promising research, but it's not without trepidation. There's still like some really strong associations with psychedelics and certain controversial ideologies. So looking back, we're able to clearly see the damage that was done to this industry, to this field, as a result of associating psychedelics with strong and controversial and like hippie political ideologies. Though I don't think that it was preventable. So going back to harm reduction, I wonder, like, it isn't impossible that the politicalization of harm reduction might actually reduce government and public support for harm reduction. And that might affect funding for these important initiatives as well. If all people who support harm reduction, all, you know, harm reductionists, if we're all perceived to be super far left in our political ideas, might that reduce support for harm reduction in those who don't identify as being in the far left? Is there a place for people to support harm reduction that might not support, say, drug decriminalization or safe supply? So it's something to think about. You know, what is the harm reduction agenda? We certainly have an agenda. What issues are foreseeable that we might mitigate through thoughtful and intentional discourse about it, so that we don't alienate some of our supporters? Now I'm going to step off my soapbox. And a couple more things here before we open it up to discussion. Harm reduction has come a long, long way since its official debut. And I think is going to continue to evolve so long as the harms of drug use are proliferating. And the harms of drug use aren't going away anytime soon, unfortunately, because prohibition is alive and well as a drug policy. So that being said, I hope that it helps to have a greater understanding of harm reduction so that we can prevent it from becoming just a buzzword that people throw around without really knowing what it means. or from becoming something that's so poorly understood that it loses support. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the future of harm reduction should or shouldn't look like, as well as like what you've observed in your practice and in your work environments. What was prevalent in your practice in terms of the attributes of harm reduction, and which ones were missing, and why do you think that is? So thanks again, everyone. And let's open it up to Q&A, Mary Lou.
Awesome. Thank you for such a well-structured webinar.
Oh, you're welcome.
That was just like perfect in terms of making it accessible. And even though we're not looking at you and we're not in the room, like it felt really engaging. Anyway, that's just my
Oh, good. Okay,
my feedback, but I don't think I'm the only one to think that. There was some action in the chat box there happening, some people commenting, but yeah, let's just open it up for people. You can use the chat option. I know using the mic is not always possible for people, so I can look at the questions. And I think it's Tim that's highlighting how great your talk was. And also Tim was really on sharing links, like the Crackdown podcast link is already in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Yes.
In the chat room. Jody is saying that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's awesome. And I think the timing of it too, I think it's definitely could not be better. It's something that I think is worth our energy and focus a little bit, especially as we face so many challenges in advocating for harm reduction. So I think some conceptual work definitely just helps to strengthen our actual work on the ground as well. It's not like two distinct activities that is, one is just for the sake of being intellectual. I do see those things as being very practical, especially in the face of so much opposition. So.
Right, and that's what I was going to say. It's been really disheartening here in Alberta with our premier and some of the language and stuff that's being used to talk about people who use drugs. So I think we need to be really clear on how we're going to counter that, so that we can make a point and people will believe us. I just wanted to touch on people talking about the wheelchairs, how it's clever, and Claire saying that we use wheelchairs. Claire, I actually got that example from you guys. So I heard it and I was like, that is such a great idea. So let's see here.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's saying, commenting on how difficult it has been politically. And I feel like this presentation brings I don't know, it just I think your timing is so good. And hold on, someone else is writing. Yeah, I'm just also reading.
I'm just reading as well. Hold on here.
Dominic?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. This is Penny Higdon calling from New Brunswick. Thank you very much for your talk. I found it really informative and helpful. In New Brunswick, we're looking at harm reduction guidance documents and guidelines, and the way you framed all the emerging attributes, I can see our policy unfolding with some of the things that you brought to light today. So
awesome.
I really appreciate, because it's not a procedural manual, it's more of a guidance document. So thank you.
Yeah, that sounds like amazing work, and I'm glad that this helped in some way. Good luck.
Yeah, for sure.
Huh. I'm going to read this comment from Shane here, that they're curious to hear about your thoughts on harm reduction versus harm acceptance in the context of harm reduction housing. Some see allowing people to use in their units as harm acceptance. Yeah. How would you respond to that in the context? Yeah, interesting. I once went to when I first started in the harm reduction field, I'm not going to say where, I went to a seminar and it was all about let's make sure that we're doing harm reduction and not harm acceptance. And it was, honestly, in my professional opinion, it was just bullshit. Harm acceptance, that's putting your values and morals of I'm accepting your behavior. I don't think you should be doing it, but I'm accepting it, which is not harm reduction is not about your judgments and your values towards drug use, right? It's about keeping people safe. So to me, I just think this idea of harm acceptance is a bit misguided, I guess, because it becomes more about how the service providers feeling about the situation, when it should be about how can we best serve this person so they don't die, first of all, and so that they have the best possible outcomes.
Yeah, and there's someone adding to this before we go to Dorothy's question. Lorelei is saying there's also a push to consider abstinence as like the ultimate harm reduction. So they appreciated the defining of the term. So just to kind of piggyback on what you were saying.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly the literature said that for some, abstinence is the final goal and it can be achieved through harm reduction. But like a goal of abstinence is not, it's kind of, I don't know, it's a bit gray, I guess, but an approach that is abstinence only is not harm reduction. But certainly people can get to abstinence if that's what they want to do through harm reduction. And yes, Jody agrees that the struggle with harm acceptance. Interesting. I wanted to go back to.
Yeah, there was Dorothy's point about them being curious about your thoughts on the concern raised by Indigenous communities that harm reduction is a move away from a traditional wellness model.
Oh man, there's a really good podcast I just listened to about this. Was it Crackdown? Somebody correct me, the most recent one? Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, and so, a caveat here is that I looked at the literature, and the literature is, as we know, not extremely well grounded in kind of presenting Indigenous voices or, non-mainstream voices, I guess. And so I think that there's space for the indigenization of harm reduction. It's not my area of specialty, but there was, it's the most recent Crackdown podcast that talks to Indigenous people about how they feel about harm reduction and which parts, seem to work for them and which part of it needs to be adapted in terms of like cultural needs and whatnot. Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll take maybe one or two more questions if there's any burning questions. People using their mics too. Yeah.
And I'm just reading through the comments as well.
It's Claire here. Thanks, Dom, for an awesome webinar.
Hi, Claire. Thanks.
Hi. I am just curious. You kind of spoke to the risks in not understanding the concept of harm reduction in terms of like when there's opposition, say from our lovely premier here in Alberta. But then I'm also curious about your thoughts in terms of when harm reduction becomes more quote unquote mainstream and becomes almost institutionalized and taken up by some of the institutions that aren't upholding all of the principles of harm reduction as you've defined it. So for example, participation of people who use substances and addressing the social determinants of health, looking at the structural issues like racism and all of the structures therein, and just kind of the risk on that end of the spectrum as well.
Yeah, and I think there's a tension there, and that's kind of what I was getting at with my rant about psychedelics. I think there's just a tension between how do we balance, like clearly there are broad structural changes, systemic changes that need to happen if we're going to, end the overdose crisis, for example. How do we get as close as possible to achieving those without alienating supporters to the point where like nothing can be accomplished? And like I don't have an answer to that.
It's an ongoing tension.
It is, and I actually think it makes for space for different groups, right? So you do have those who are coming from the public health angle, who are publicly funded and kind of have to stick to this a little bit more or less political way of doing things. And then you have space for the other grassroots groups, perhaps the drug user groups, to bring in those other pieces. And I think it's really important that those, if you will, two groups are talking to each other and supporting one another, so that there's a more full conversation happening. I know, I suspect some of you have a different opinion than that, like, let's just smash it down, I don't have an answer, but it's a really good question.
Yeah, and I guess your response has brought up for me, there's the concept of kind of the four roles of allies in a movement, and that all of those roles are needed. We can
Mm,
try to find the article and share it in the chat box. But
that'd be great.
yeah, there's some good stuff around that, and thinking of how we work together at all ends of that spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah, and it kind of goes back to, there's no single way of going about harm reduction, and that's the beauty of it. So the more folks who are engaging and doing what is within their means to do, the better, I think. But there does need to be some collaborative work there so that we can actually achieve some of the things, the big goals that we would like to achieve. Yeah, the polarization issue, Carrie, is definitely, yeah, I think it's really tough, and it is such a balance. I don't know, does anyone have any ideas about that, or maybe examples of how they've managed that in their workplace?
Well, it's Marilou here. I don't want to just take up all the space, but I just quick example was during the election. I co-wrote with 3 people here from the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research, like an op-ed, just challenging the idea that treatment and harm reduction are 2 separate kind of worlds. And I think producing counter narratives is really important. So when we see, for example, harm reduction being pinned as something because it serves a political agenda, right? So it's like it serves like to demonize people who use drugs and to cut funding and stuff like that. I think there is also power in producing counter narratives to challenge that and to use, again, like to go back to Claire and your point, Dominique, around allyships. Like we do have to make full use of everyone in every sectors that can push in the same direction. And that sometimes means, like playing that card of being like, as scientists and experts and blah, blah. But sometimes I know this is not to reinforce hierarchies around like who holds knowledge and stuff like that. But we're faced with a very powerful system. And I think when we have great clarity around what we're working towards, it allows everyone to step in with their full power, right? And full skills to contribute to the project of harm reduction, as opposed to being like, oh, well, I don't know if I'm making sense, but just to highlight that there's a lot of strategies that we can use and use even a lot more. But for that, sometimes it means that people have to feel comfortable that they can indeed use their full power and step into that space and fight for certain things using their full privilege and position. And produce these counter narratives, because otherwise we're just gonna, we're faced with oppositions that are extremely strategic, very well organized, very well resourced, and a lot smarter than we give them credit for. And we have to, I think, organize accordingly. And part of it is having very clear conceptual understanding of what we're talking about.
Yes, totally. Yes to all you said.
Anyway, sorry. I was like, oh my God. I don't want to necessarily cut but I have to go to a meeting, but you're the host right now. So if ever you want to stretch the discussion period, I can let you kind of wrap up.
Okay. There's just a question here about whether the recording will be available after. Marilou, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, actually, all the recordings are available. They are available in our membership space. I mean, that's the one thing is where we host all our kind of work that we do is not in our public facing website. It's in our interfacing membership portal. So if you're a member, you can log in and have access to all our resources. And we're currently building a resource library also for our members. And I know it's always tricky, right? Because we want to make it super available. For this one, since it was public, I'm more than happy to share the link if you're okay with that, Dominique, in like a public way. But generally speaking, with our HRNA stuff, we try to encourage people to sign up as members, just because if we don't collect these very small membership fees annually, we can't run anything. It's just like our kind of basic budget to even have a webinar, for example, and a website and stuff like that. But if you're okay with this, Dominique, I could make this like a public one on YouTube, because that's what we use.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Thanks for doing that. Yeah, and I think I will just add, because a few people have asked for my contact. So Marilou, if you have to go, that's totally fine, and I'll just stop the recording shortly here and just finish up.
Perfect. And thank you again for everyone for attending, and just keep an eye out for our in-person event that's happening in Edmonton and on May 21st with a focus on hospital-based harm reduction. It's going to be very, very good program. We're going to launch the program in the next few weeks, and you won't want to miss this. So just keep an eye out for that event. It will be great to see you all in person, and the program is going to be really excellent. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much, Dominique. It was fantastic.
Perfect. Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just putting let me make sure it's right, my email address in there for Penny and Claire. Yeah. Yes, you're very welcome. I hope that it made sense. I love all these comments. Thanks, everyone. Lots of great discussion. Okay, any burning things that we should talk about in our last minute or two? Thanks, Trish. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my life in New York over here. Thanks, everyone. Hope everyone has a great day.